We're going to take a look at some criticisms of utilitarianism here. Some of the criticisms will apply only to certain versions of utilitarianism. Some will attack both. Some will be aimed just at others. So you want to make sure and keep those things straight. According to utilitarianism, or rather act utilitarianism, what are we supposed to do with the murder at the door scenario? Yeah, you're supposed to break your promise here, right? So the consequences of this setup look like it's going to end up with one dead person, right? Versus no dead people. It's a numbers game with utilitarianism, right? So that's looks like the criticism there, or excuse me, looks like the implication there for act utilitarianism. Probably many of us would do the same thing, whether we consider ourselves to be act utilitarians or not. And then I had you look at these various thought experiments here. So one of the criticisms, so this looks like an easy thing for the act utilitarian, right? Calculate utility. The trolley problem looks like a fairly easy one for the act utilitarian. One person dies versus 5 living, so the one's got to go, right? So that looks like how it would cash out for at least the act utilitarian. So then we look at these thought experiments. Let me go to the results for these. Let's see, have I answered them? Oh, I need to close them so we can see the results. Availability, what time is it? 2. So let's see. Take a second here to close those. Let's see what y'all did on this one. So on the, let's see, that was the transplant surgeon. So you might remember that from as being one of the thought experiments in addition to the trolley problem that White talked about. So here's one that maybe looks like an act utilitarian would give us counterintuitive implications. Most of y'all said 5, the doctor shouldn't kill the guy to redistribute his organs. No, the doctor should not, or yes, he should transplant the organs. 33 people said no, the doctor should not transplant the organs, but what does it look like the act utilitarian answer is there? Yeah, redistribute some organs, right? So that kind of looks like a counterintuitive implication because you're killing one innocent person, right? Same thing in the first version of the trolley problem, right? So that looks like the answer there. Then, or at least both y'all's responses and the act utilitarian. Internet's going to be slow today. The DA sitting on evidence, so suppressing evidence. Let's see what y'all said about this one. And what time do I need? 7 there will show. I'm going to put I don't know. See, it shows me the results. It's not going to give me the results. What did I do wrong?
It's 2 p.m.
That's what I did wrong. Thank you. So on this one, oops, don't want to do that. This is why I hate online classes, because there's like 9,000 things to click. So let's see. DA sitting on evidence, it's an obligation. 5 people said it's obligation to sit on the evidence. 13 people said it's permissible to sit on the evidence. 16 people said it's not permissible to do so. 2 people other than me said no. But I bet if the DA was sitting on evidence on your case, you wouldn't like that too much. You would consider that what?
Unfair.
Unfair, unjust, right? So, but on the act utilitarian response, looks like the DA is supposed to sit on the evidence there, right? Let's look at the next one. Can't remember if it's the fourth strike or the grade change. Fourth strike. Close this one out. Honest results, availability. Let's see the fourth strike example where the batter asked for another chance after he's had 3 strikes. 2 people said it's an obligation to give the guy another chance. 4 people said it's permissible to give the batter a 4th strike. 28 people, and this usually cashes out all the same, see that as unfair, right? 28 people. But act utilitarianism looks like it says obligation again, right?
Well, why do you say that the happiness would go down because the other people would see?
We'll have to worry a little bit about that, but I'm about to come back to somebody's responses to each of these. Right? These are not like from, I'm setting up a thing here. Okay. So we got the 4th strike, and then we got a plea for a grade change. I know how y'all are going to answer this one. Results. See what most people said here. 4 people said it's an obligation to change the grade. 16 people said it's permissible to change the grade. And 16 people said it's impermissible to change the grade. But act utilitarianism sounds like what? Obligation to change the grade, right? So there's act utilitarianism, independent of what y'all thought, looking like it implies some, at least to many people, counterintuitive moral conclusions about what we ought to do. So maybe something's wrong with act utilitarianism. So first objection to act utilitarianism, counterintuitive implications, but maybe there's a way for the utilitarian to save his theory by modifying it. So let's take a look at Hospers, who does that. His name's John Hospers. He was actually a candidate for president in the U.S. in 1972. That was a long time ago. It's the year I was born, so quite a long time ago. Died in 2011, though. He was a libertarian philosopher who drew on rule utilitarianism to advocate for libertarian political philosophies. So in each of these, it looks like the act utilitarian, or what Hospers calls the standard utilitarian, is to do each of those things, but they look counterintuitive. So he says, here's an example with the student grade change, right? He says, after pondering the matter, the student appeals to the fact that they think he's a utilitarian. So sharing premises. So after pondering the matter, I persist in believing that it would not be right to change the grade under these circumstances. Perhaps you agree with my decision, and perhaps you don't, but if you agree that I should not have changed the grade, and if you are also a utilitarian, how are you going to reconcile such a decision with utilitarianism? Ex hypothesi, which just means from the hypothesis that we're considering, the greatest amount of happiness will be brought by my changing the grade, so why shouldn't I change it? And this in turn raises an interesting question. If it's wrong for me to do it, the act in publicly, isn't it also wrong for me to do it secretly, right? Because the student appeals, nobody will know what we're doing, right? So, and then we had the plea for leniency from the guilty man. So what would we do on that one? And yet we feel, or at least many people would, that it's wrong to release him would be a mistake. The sentence imposed on him is the minimum permitted by the law for his offense, and he should serve out his term in accordance with that law. Suppressing the evidence. Again, I wouldn't want evidence to be suppressed against me when I'm in jail, which is highly probable. that I'm going to court sometime. We may not be able to articulate why, but we feel strongly that the district attorney should not sit on the evidence, but that he should reveal every scrap of evidence he knows, even though the reevaluation means releasing the prisoner to do more crimes and be convicted of them later, right? So what conclusion emerges from these examples? If the examples point at all in the right direction, they indicate that there are some acts which it is right to perform, even though by themselves they will not have good consequences. He uses a voting example, so I don't vote, so it's not going to stop everybody else from voting, but don't you have an obligation to vote in a democratic society, right? So if the examples point in the direction, it looks like we've got a problem here. And that there are some acts which it is wrong to perform, even though by themselves they would have good consequences, such as sitting on the evidence in the DA case. But this conclusion is opposed to the utilitarianism that we have considered, as we have considered it thus far, which is the act, or what he's calling standard utilitarianism there. So he says this example of the baseball player asking for a fourth strike, he says this example, though only an analogy, gives us a clue to the kind of theory we're about to consider. Let's call it rule utilitarianism. So they've already introduced a couple different forms of utilitarianism: act, rule, and then virtue, consequent virtue utilitarianism in the article for last time. He's saying that Hospers is saying act utilitarianism runs into counterintuitive implications, but we can fix it by modifying utilitarianism. We don't have to give up on the utilitarian basic idea. So how is it going to be modified here? Let's call it rule utilitarianism. Briefly stated, and here's the key idea, rule utilitarianism comes to this: each act in the moral life falls under a moral rule. And we are to judge the rightness or wrongness of the act, not by the consequences of that act, but by the consequences of its universalization. So we got another universalizability argument coming in here. It's going to sound like Kant's, but it's not Kantian. So not the consequences of the act itself, but the consequences of the rule universalization. So that is by the consequences of adopting the rule under which the act falls. This interpretation of Kant's categorical imperative is different from Kant in being concerned with consequences. But it retains the key feature Kant introduced, that of universalizability. So here the question is not the individual act, the issue and the consequences of that individual act, maximizing or minimizing harm and utility, but what if everybody followed this rule as opposed to some alternative rule? What would have better consequences, right? So thus, here's this example, the district attorney may do more good in a particular case by sitting on the evidence, but even if this case has no consequences for future cases, you have to worry about precedents in law, right? And in morality, really. It's just they're official in the law, in legal matters. For future cases, because nobody ever finds out, it would be done in secret, right? Still, the general policy or practice of doing this kind of thing is a very bad one. It uproots a basic principle of our legal system, namely that innocent people should not be condemned. Notice the issue there is individual rights, not maximal good. So that should sound a little bit Kantian there as well. So our persistent conviction that it would be wrong for him to conceal the evidence in this case comes not from the conviction that concealing the evidence will produce less good. We may be satisfied that it will produce more good in this particular case, but from the conviction that the practice of doing this kind of thing will have very bad consequences. Would it have very bad consequences if every DA sat on evidence? Sure would, right? We'd have a lot of innocent people in jail. So to put it in Kantian language, the maxim of the action, if universalized, would have bad consequences. The last part of that is the non-Kantian part, the non-deontological part. But the individual act of not voting on a specific occasion, or of any one person's not voting as long as others continue to vote, would probably have no bad consequences. It's not that big a deal if I pour my spent oil down the drain in the street, but what if everybody put spent oil down the drain? Is that going to have bad consequences? Yeah, pretty obviously, right? So again, think about the grade change. What would happen if everybody changed the grades? We'd have the situation we have now where people don't really think that a college degree is worth it very much because it's no longer indicative of that individual's capabilities, right? Your employers would certainly be very upset, your potential employers, right, would be upset if that college degree didn't signal what that college degree is supposed to signal, right? So there are some kinds of acts which would have little or no effect if any one person or two or three even does them, but which have very considerable effects if everyone or even just a large number does them. Rule utilitarianism can take care of those cases. Savannah.
So this is also like the cutting in line kind of thing, no?
How do you see it as being alike there?
Like if a couple of people did it, right? Like one or two or three, right? It wouldn't have very considerable effects, but if everyone does it, you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, so as long as you're not thinking about deontology there.
No, not at all.
Yeah, it would have very bad, so the standard is different,
Yeah.
right? So if everybody adopted that practice, would it have better or worse consequences than adopting some other alternative practice? Yeah, so in the cutting in line example with deontology, it's not the consequences that matter, it's the contradiction,
Right.
the double standard that matters. Here, the double standard is not what is at issue, it's the consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So if everybody changed grades to give everybody an A when they're really a D student, right, that would have pretty bad consequences, right? So that's what he's driving at is here. It's universalization, but it's not Kantian universalization, it's utilitarian universalization. What are the consequences of not the individual act, but of everybody adopting a certain practice or institution? So rule utilitarianism also takes care of situations which are more puzzling to traditional or standard utilitarianism, namely the secrecy with which an act is performed. But no one will ever know, this is like the grade change one, right? So my act won't have any consequences for future acts of the same kind, the utilitarian argued. And we felt that he was being somehow irrelevant, even immoral. That if something is wrong when people know about it, it's just as wrong when it's done in secret. I can think of stuff that's really bad that's often done in secret. They're internet pedophiles, right? So it wouldn't matter if they were just doing it to one person, right? It's bad even if they're getting away with it in secret. There was I forget it was in the news, but there was like somebody that just recently got in trouble in Louisiana. I think it was Louisiana. So this condition is relevant according to traditional utilitarianism, for if some act with bad consequences is never known to anyone, this ignorance might mitigate the bad consequences, for it undeniably keeps the act from setting an example or setting a precedent. But of course, most of the time, somebody sees you do something, and whether it's okay or not, if there's a permission structure that allows it, then they go do the bad thing too. We end up with a bad precedent there. So it's the result of the practice which is bad, not the result of the single action that's bad. The result of the practice is bad whether the act is done in secret or not. The result of the practice changes grades in secret is just as bad as the result of the practice done in full knowledge of everyone. It would be equally deleterious, which means bad, to the grading system, equally bad to the index of the student's actual achievement, and bad for your potential employers, right? So here's how rule utilitarianism is going to differ a little bit. So we got two different versions of utilitarian moral reasoning at work here, right? We got the act one, which is pretty straightforward. What are the consequences of the particular action? Now it's a little bit more complicated. We're trying to think about what are the foreseeable consequences of everyone following rule A as opposed to some alternative rule. So it's universalization. So the rule then is this. We should consider the consequences of the general performance of certain cases, like keeping promises is an easy example, of actions only if that class contains within itself no subclasses, the consequence of the general practice which would be better or worse than the consequences of the act itself. So we've got telling a lie or keeping a promise, and it comes under some rule. And here again, we're going to have to worry about how that rule is formulated. We've already seen one example with deontology of where very general rules don't look like they're very good rules. They're either permit too much or prohibit too little in the case of the Kantians. And here we're going to have a similar idea. General rules aren't going to survive this test very well. They're going to have some exceptions built into them. So consider the difference between always keep your promises when it has no bad consequences, and always keep your promises unless breaking that would have much better consequences than keeping it. Those are different rules, right? One of them has the exceptions built into it. One of them is just this general blanket statement that's very easy to come up with a counterexample to. So the trick is to arrive, as Hosper's point out, at rules which, if adopted by everyone, gotta keep that universalization in mind, would have the very best possible consequences, which include, of course, the absolute minimum of bad consequences. So here we go a little bit. These qualifications of the rule are not, strictly speaking, exceptions to the rule. According to rule utilitarianism, once that rule is fully stated, it admits of no exceptions, but there may be, and indeed usually are, numerous classes of exceptions built into the rule. And you've probably experienced this with your parents as you went from being a little kid and they said always tell the truth to you get a little bit older and they're, well, yeah, tell the truth, but you don't have to always tell your best friend some more bad news after their dad's just died, right? So things start to get built into it. Where did I drop off? There we go. So thus, if a man kills someone in self-defense, we do not consider his act wrong. We're not making an exception to the rule. Rather, his act falls under the rule that includes killing in self-defense as one of the classes of acts which is permissible. This always drives me up the wall when I hear people talk how violence is never acceptable. Obviously, or let me put it this way, violence is acceptable when it's in self-defense. Right? So the rule, never be violent, doesn't look like a very good rule under rule utilitarianism. If everybody could put their phones away for me.
How does deontology tackle self-defense?
You can't. So the second formula of the categorical imperative is protect humanity, either in yourself or in others, and never let it be used as a mere means. So anytime I'm being attacked without provocation, unjustly, I can protect myself from violent death because they're instigating and I'm retaliating.
Right.
Yeah. So that's how it does it. So for most, let me think for a second. I think except for probably most, there are some let me put it this way. Every deontological version of deontology that I can recall right now has self-defense built into it. It's not pacifism. There are some pacifists that would say no violence is ever acceptable, even to save your own mother's life. You got to find a different way to help save your mother's life than be violent. So that's for saints.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, not protecting yourself, so protecting you or others. So you can come up with arguments for humanitarian intervention on deontological grounds. When people's universal human rights are getting violated by the government, we can go stop that government.
So, would you put self-defense and mutual combat in the same category?
I'm sorry, what was the second
Would
thing?
you put self-defense and mutual combat in the same category?
What do you mean by mutual?
Like,
combat?
in Chicago, there's a law now stated as like mutual combat, where if someone has like brandished a weapon or anything.
Oh, that's like our stand your ground laws?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like if someone just come up to you with a firearm, you're not legally able to.
Well, it's a defense, is the way I've usually seen those laws written. It's not an automatic thing, but it's a defense.
Some people would use it like it was mutual combat, so now I can walk up to you just because I know you have a knife in your pocket, I can shoot you now.
Yeah, I would want to see more about that law before I comment on it. So one thing is, for the purposes of this class, I'm going to separate what's legal in various different states versus what's moral. So those things do change. So it's de facto versus de jure stuff. But stand your ground laws are predicated on self-defense grounds usually, right? So in our state, I know the law here a little bit better. Any space that you legally occupy, whether it's in your home or not, it's an extension of the castle doctrine in this state's laws anyway. But it's not like an automatic thing. You have to prove it was self-defense in court. You don't just get to, unless it's like prima facie, obviously self-defense stuff. They won't arrest you for that. But usually you still get processed, and then it's a defense in court.
I don't want to derail this too much,
Yeah.
but I kind of had a similar question. Like, if it's like an old Western duel where, like, two people were like, we want a duel, because some people think that's not legal.
Yeah.
Does utilitarianism or deontology have any thoughts about that?
Well, they all have implications for those sorts of things, but we're going to have to know like a lot of what are the facts of that hypothetical.
The context. I
Yeah,
got
we
you.
need to know all of those, especially for utilitarianism, because the facts are going to, be different, and in some cases, violence is going to be okay or permissible, if not obligatory, and in other situations, it won't be.
I get you.
Usually, there's a big epistemic bar that has to be met. So, like in the Joker scenario, there's a way of thinking, right? And White even mentioned self-defense is against the Joker there, right? Mm-hmm. So you got to worry about what you know about that other agent. Are they making threats? Are they just talking shit?
Yeah.
How to know whether you should reasonably be in fear or
Or
not?
if they're like drunk and irrational or something.
Yeah, stuff like that. All those sorts of things are going to matter. So it depends on, the law of the state. But yeah, every moral theory has something to say about when violence is or isn't permissible. Just stress, yeah. So it's all of those things are going to have to be part of the rules spelled out and enunciated.
Yeah.
So we can now see how our previous remarks about acts committed in secret fit into the rule utilitarian scheme. On the one hand, the rule don't break a promise except A, under extreme duress, and 2, to promote some very great good is admittedly somewhat vague, and perhaps it could still be improved by still stricter further qualification. But at least it is much better than the simple rule, never break promises. If that's the rule, and I'm supposed to take that literally, then I've got to, tell the truth to the Nazi at the door and hope that he's going to do some calculations on his own, stop being a Nazi all of a sudden, right? And so forth, right? Versus the rule, don't break a promise except when nobody will know about it, or those other versions. So rule utilitarianism might come out with the same conclusion as act utilitarianism to our murder at the door, because that scenario looks like it's going to maybe fit one and certainly two, if not one as well. Make some sense? So the rules matter there. So that's why among the circumstances which excuse you from keeping your word, the fact that it was broken in secret or something like that is not one of them, or it's done publicly or not, and with very good reason. It's this class of exceptions which are incorporated into the rule, so that rule's adoption would have far worse effects than if it was another rule. So here it's like, before I did it where it was just one act A and then another act B, there are usually various ways of formulating the rule. You have to think about each of them and figure out which of the consequences of everyone following rule A versus the alternatives would be the correct rule. Right? So the rule that if everyone follows, if that's the rule that would maximize overall happiness, that's the rule we're always supposed to abide by, whether other people do or not. Now there is an objection to that from act utilitarians, which say for any rule you come up with, we can find an instance in which you should break it based on the particular consequences, right? So there's a little bit of a back and forth between rule and act utilitarians there. So think of it with a torture interrogation scenario. If you're an act utilitarian, the ticking time bomb scenario is a pretty clear answer. Suppose you're an FBI field agent and you have just apprehended a suspected terrorist, so they're not a known terrorist, they're just suspected, right? So that's something that matters, whether they're a known terrorist versus just a suspected guy. Maybe he just hangs out with some terroristy dudes.
He says an associate too.
Yeah. That is otherwise innocent, but you have knowledge of a terrorist plot set off a dirty bomb in a large city. You believe the suspected terrorist knows the location of the bomb, but he's not talking, so act utilitarian starts to look like torture's okay there, right? But here's the thing for even the act utilitarian. You have to be relatively sure that the torture's going to work to produce actionable information that would allow you to stop the bomb. If you don't have that, suppose if it's a guy that's been trained to withstand torture, you no longer have a reason to think the torture will produce actionable information, and it wouldn't justify that action, right? So there's a high epistemic bar there. Same problem with knowing whether this guy's just talking trash to me or is really threatening my life. Right. What just happened there? Savannah, question, just stretching?
Oh, yes, sir. I'm just.
So act utilitarian looks like maybe they're going to torture some people if they get the right sorts of conditions. But what about the institution of institutionalized torture? Well, that's going to cause some problems, right? First of all, you have to weed out the sadists because they make bad torturers. They'll keep torturing people, right? Whether they get in action or not. Divorce rates among people in that category are really high, so there's all sorts of different effects you have to worry about there. So the rule utilitarian is going to say, no, we ought to, and plus, like, well, what are they going to do when our guys get caught? They're going to, if we're torturing people, they're going to torture people. Now we have a lot more bad in the world, right? So adhere to policies where you don't do those sorts of things. So here's a case where you can see them splitting between act and rule utilitarian there. It's a good test case. There's a good movie called, I think it's Unthinkable. Let me check. Yeah, this is it. It's Unthinkable. It's got Samuel L. Jackson in it, and this guy right here is a former U.S. Special Ops guy that's been trained to withstand torture, and they're trying to torture him to get information. So, you know, there you don't look like you're going to have, if you've been trained to withstand it, then you're going to have some hesitation about whether that torture is going to work or not at all. Right? So it's a pretty good movie there on that front. All right, now let's turn to Nozick. Before we do that, let's take a look at your responses to the Nozick thought experience machine thought experiment. Most people said that they would not plug in. That's 28 said that. 9 people said that they would plug in. 1 person was, I don't know. All right, so again, here's the scenario. Suppose, let me back up. Remember our 2 ingredients of, again, this is going to be classical hedonism. All right, so Mill and Bentham's version of it, not like more contemporary versions. Hedonism, the idea that pleasure is intrinsically good. And then egalitarianism, that everybody's happiness is weighed equally. The units of pleasure and pain don't change just because you're a minister versus a criminal. Everybody's pain, even non-human pain and happiness matter. So our 2 ingredients: hedonism and egalitarianism. Here's Nozick. Nozick's well-known. Again, another libertarian type of philosopher here, but he's a Kantian. So unlike Hospers, who argued for libertarianism on utilitarian grounds, Nozick argues for it on Kantian grounds. So here's the first objection. Nozick, in his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, he argues that utilitarian theory is embarrassed by the possibility of utility monsters. Utility monsters get enormously greater sums of utility or happiness from any sacrifice of others than these others lose. So for every time, so suppose I'm the utility monster. You stub your toe and you get 1 unit of pain, but I get, like, let's say 1,000 units of happiness from watching that. So now we got a problem. Now you all got to torture yourselves in order to maximize happiness, right? So the theory seems to require that we all be sacrificed to the monster's maw in order to increase total utility. So there's also total utilitarianism versus average utilitarianism. He's attacking the total utility version there. But it seems to upset the idea that everybody's pleasure and pain matters equally on there, right? One of the assumptions of classical utilitarianism is that physiologically we all experience those things the same. Now here's the experience machine. So here's his second one. This one's not going to go after the egalitarian ingredient. It's going to go over the hedonism. Again, if everybody could put their phones away for me. It's really obvious when people are doing that, you're either obsessively staring at your crotch, which is weird from my vantage point, or on a phone. So suppose there was an experience machine. This isn't hard for us to imagine. We're going to have VR like this pretty quick. Suppose there's an experience machine that would give you any experience you desire. super duper neurophysiologist could stimulate your brain so that you would think and feel as if you were reading the great American novel or making a friend or reading an interesting book. All of these, all the time you would be floating in a tank with electrodes attached to your brain. Suppose you plug into this machine for life, pre-programming your life experience. Of course, while you're in the tank, you won't know that you're there and you'll think it's actually happening. Would you plug in? What does classical utilitarianism seem to imply that we should do here? Plug in. We'd be maximizing overall happiness, right? Something seems a little off about that, probably to most of us, though, right? So here's Nozick, who's a Kantian. Again, I'm saying that because several of these should have a fairly Kantian ring to you here. He gives 3 reasons against plugging in. So 3 reasons that he thinks we shouldn't plug in, and therefore that something's wrong with hedonism, the view that pleasure's the only intrinsic good. So he says it's only because we first want to do the actions that we want the experience of doing them. So it misses that, he claims. 2, and this one's really the Kantian element of it. Remember, humanity, rational agents. Someone floating in the tank becomes an intermediate blob. In other words, you become a non-person, basically. 3rd, there's no actual contact with any deeper reality, though the experience of it can be stimulated. And his upshot is that we want actual contact with reality. You want the actual accomplishment, not just the feeling of the accomplishment, right? So here's our little argument. Nozick classic contra utilitarianism. If hedonism is true, hedonism here means is the thesis that pleasure is the only intrinsic good, right? And pain's intrinsically bad. So everything else is just a means to maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain. Again, there's no intrinsically wrong actions according to utilitarianism. I can kill an innocent person so long as it maximizes overall happiness, right? So if hedonism is true, then classical utilitarianism is the correct moral theory. Hedonism is true, thus classical utilitarianism is not the correct moral theory. Which premise in that argument is Nozick challenging? Let's do a little vote here. We got 1, 2, 1 and 2 both. Then we got line 3. Is line 3 a premise? No, so we know it's not 3. So that leaves us with 1, 2, or 1 and 2. How many people say just 1? 1. How many people say 2? That looks like the majority of the class. And then 1 and 2. Anybody think both? Got 2 people there. He's saying that we don't just want pleasure, we want to actually do the things. Which premise in there is asserting that all we want is pleasure? 2. Going after 2 there. So again, if you plugged yourself into a machine and you were no longer making decisions, it was all be pre-programmed. It looks like you're taking away the thing that makes you human, namely your capacity to reflect on reasons. So there's Nozick. And then, let's see, let's do one more. I've got a little bit of time here. Let's go back to unity. Computer's really slow today. All right, so remember unity. Turns everybody into a hive mind, but it's a perfect society, right?
That's a good answer. That's a good answer.
So they plug in, right? Unity she strips them of their individuality, basically, right? So here's Bernard Williams. He was a pretty important 20th century philosopher that criticized both Kantianism and utilitarianism. He's basically an anti-realist philosopher. So remember Summer's initial objection to unification. She says they've lost their individuality, right? They've just become this hive mind. And so here's a thought experiment from Williams. Williams claims that utilitarianism disregards the separateness of people. Separateness of people, disregards that. So here's George. George has just taken his PhD in chemistry, finds it difficult to get a job. He's not robust in health, which cuts down the number of jobs he might be able to do. His wife has to work, which causes a great deal of strain since they have small children. The results of all this on the children are damaging. An older chemist says that he can get George a decently paid job in a laboratory which pursues research in chemical warfare. George says that he cannot accept this since he's opposed to chemical warfare. The older man replies that he's not too keen on it himself, but George's refusal is not going to make the job or the lab go away. What's more, if George refuses the job, it would certainly go to the contemporary of George's who is not inhibited by his scruples and is likely to push the research with greater zeal than George would. What should George do? According to utilitarianism, seems like George ought to do what here? Take the job, right? Do the job, but not like make the worst weapons possible, right? Here's Jim in South America. Jim finds himself in a small South American town. Tied up against the wall are a row of 20 Indians, most terrified, a few defiant, in front of several armed men in uniform. However, Jim is an honored visitor from another land. The captain is happy to offer Jim's a guest privilege of killing one of the Indians himself. If Jim accepts, then as a special mark of the occasion, the other Indians will be let go. Of course, if Jim refuses, then there's no special occasion, and Pedro here will do what he was about to do when Jim arrived and kill them all. The men are against the wall. The other villagers understand the situation and are obviously begging Jim, to accept. According to utilitarianism, what should Jim do here? Kill one, save the others, right? That looks like, it almost looks like it's pretty obvious from a basic utilitarian standpoint that that's the answer for both of those things, right? Here's Williams. To these dilemmas, utilitarianism replies in the first case that George should accept the job, and in the second that Jim should kill the Indian. Not only does utilitarianism gives these answers, but if no other special factors, it regards them as obviously the right answers. But as many of us would certainly wonder whether in one, that could possibly be the right answer, and in two, even one who came to think that it was the right answer might well wonder whether it was the obvious answer. Nor is it just a question of the rightness or obviousness of these answers. It is also a question of what sorts of consideration come into finding the answer. Utilitarianism cuts out the idea that each of us is specially responsible for what he does rather than what other people do. It is this idea is closely connected to the value of integrity. It's often suspected that utilitarianism makes integrity as a value more or less unintelligible, and I'll try to show that that suspicion is correct. Integrity, keeping to your own values, right? Keeping to your own values. So in the two situations have in common that if the agent does not do a certain disagreeable thing, someone else will. And remember, what we're worried about are just these social relationships of cause and effect, right? Precedent and so forth. What occurs if Jim refrains from the action is not solely that 20 Indians dead, but Pedro kills those 20 Indians. It's not Jim killing those Indians if he refuses. Pedro kills them, but the utilitarian calculation disregards that difference because all it's worried about is the outcome, right? So it looks like, according to utilitarians, that their view has what it's called negative responsibility. You're responsible for what you do as well as what you don't do. And if I spend my money on buying a fast sports car rather than a more modestly priced car, then I'm responsible for not donating that money to charity, right? To alleviating suffering. So that looks like utilitarianism. It requires us to step away from our commitments. But what if it conflicts with a project of mine? What if it conflicts with my integrity, right? So he says here, I'm going to skip this one. Well, actually, no, I'm not going to skip this one. So utilitarianism requires us or alienates Jim in a real sense from his actions, or George from his, as the source of account, as himself being the source of his account of his own convictions. It is to make him a channel between the input of everyone else's projects, including his own, and the output of an optimal, right, decision. But it is to neglect the extent to which his actions and decisions have to be seen as actions and decisions which flow from the projects and attitudes with which he is most closely identified. In this sense, in the most literal sense, it's an attack on his integrity. So what utilitarian requires us to do is step away from whatever other moral commitments we might have, including our own. Suppose that Jim is a pacifist. It would require Jim to abandon pacifism and maximize overall utility. Right. So you'd have to step away from whatever your own commitments are to maximize utility. So in Kantianism, we're behind a veil of ignorance where we're just rationaling as rational agents, qua rational agents. We're not taking into account all these special features that make us individuals who we are, right? And in utilitarianism, we don't stand in relationship to each other as members of a particular community or student and teacher. It's just and vice versa. You're either the possible potential victim or benefactor of my actions, and I yours. So it strips us away of all that other stuff, and it's just a calculation of utility. Nothing else matters. So that looks like utilitarianism fails to account for other important moral values because all it's doing is emphasizing the outcomes and producing pleasurable states of affairs. But we are obligated to do that even if we don't want to, right? So there's the integrity or the alienation objection, which again, let me go back, is pretty similar. You got to read a little bit into it, but that's basically what Summer was objecting to with regard to unity. She was like, you took Jim away from Jim, right, and made him a function in your perfect society. And she also looks like a utility monster, right, because it's only her pleasure that's mattering anymore there. So some basic objections to utilitarianism there. It's not working out real well there. So we've got quite a few. Here's a list of several of them. We've gone over a bunch of these already. Last class, I went over Mill's objection to Bentham. Many of the counterintuitive implications are just versions of the ends justify immoral means objection, so killing an innocent in order to maximize overall happiness. Utilitarianism also eliminates supererogatory actions, so actions that are above and beyond duty. How many of y'all think that some actions would be really good to perform, but you're not obligated to perform them, right? I think there's a lot of actions like that.
Like citizens arrest.
Well, even if I wanted to donate all my money and make me poor and something like that, right? That would be a supererogatory act, right? So those are acts that are above and beyond duty. Deontology can handle those. You can jump on the grenade and save all your friends if you want to, according to deontology. But according to utilitarianism, you're obligated to jump on that grenade, right? So that looks like it eliminates supererogatory acts because any act that would maximize overall happiness, it's not above and beyond duty, it is your duty to do those things. So some people think utilitarian eliminates those sorts of actions. That was covered in the reading for today. We went over Hosper's objections to act utilitarianism, Williams and Nozick. We didn't do the rule worshiping objection, but real quickly, what it comes down to is you're worshiping the rules regardless of what everybody else is doing because theoretically, if everyone followed them, it would maximize happiness even though everybody's not following them. So rule worshiping objection. All right, so that's a little bit on utilitarianism.